Hi, everyone. Welcome to Relationship Building with Students and Adults Experiencing Trauma. My name is Fredrica Nash, and I'm here with my colleague, Lori Baker.
Hello, everyone.
We are from the Center for Education Services at RTI International, which is a nonprofit headquartered in North Carolina. In a time of unpredictability, social unrest, and social distress, all of which are types of trauma, building relationships is of critical importance. Additionally, with everyone experiencing shared trauma through the global coronavirus pandemic and social protests, we will share ways to practice self-care and how to build relationships during and after these times. Our outcomes for today are to understand primary trauma and its impact on individuals, specifically students, to understand secondary traumatic stress and its impact on educators, and also to establish connections between trauma, relationships, and resilience. First, let's talk about trauma. Trauma has a significant impact on groups and individuals. Each individual experiences trauma differently. We can't say how much of an impact any trauma has on an individual because that trauma is an individualized experience. We cannot assume that the way we experience or how we feel or how we deal with trauma will be the exact same for everyone else, even if we experience the traumatic event together. Let's take a look at a definition of trauma. Take a minute to read through this definition. Let's break down this definition just a bit. So there are 3 E's of trauma. That's how we oftentimes remember the definition of trauma, by the 3 E's. So the first E refers to an event. So an event is a situation that happens. This situation is then experienced, which is the second E, by an individual. The event plus the experience then has adverse effects on the individual, effects being the third E. Notice that this definition, as I stated before, focuses on the individual. We all respond to trauma differently. We all experience things differently. This also goes for happy memories. When we retell stories of our experiences, and 3 or 4 people shared in that same event and all had different experiences and different effects. And so our retelling of the story changes, and we pick up little pieces from others because that wasn't our experience, but it seemed like it would have been our experience. So as we think about trauma and we think about the different types of trauma that we'll get to in just a second, we have to remember that even though groups do go through trauma, it is the individual that experiences that trauma and the effects on that individual that trauma really impacts. So immediately when we hear the word trauma or when we think about trauma's impact and how the impact of trauma manifests itself through outward-facing feelings or behaviors. We often don't see the inward effects of trauma. So trauma that we experience firsthand is known as primary trauma. And when we experience the trauma that leads to adverse effects on us, it often overwhelms our ability to cope. It doesn't mean that we lack coping skills. It is that we don't have access or those skills are inaccessible to us at the time because we are overwhelmed with the effect of the trauma, or it's that we need to build skills to combat build skills and resilience to combat that trauma that we currently may not have. Trauma also results in feelings of terror and helplessness and powerlessness, and can interfere with our feelings of self-control and the importance of connection and relationships. So what does this look like in schools? We often use the image of the iceberg, where what we see on the surface is incomparable to what's underneath the surface. So when we see that students are throwing things, or they seem withdrawn, or they appear overly helpful on the opposite end of that continuum, or they're hitting and fighting or cursing, the behaviors that we often think are disrespectful or are against our authority could be the result of acting out against a feelings of being unsafe. So this could result in being tired. It could be because there's a lot of uncertainty. It could be due to community violence. It could be due to racism or divorce. There are a lot of things under the surface that when the outward feelings and behaviors show up, they don't tell us. So when I'm sitting in silence alone by myself, it doesn't tell you that I'm tired or I'm scared. And it's not until we have an authentic relationship with students that we might be able to uncover some of the things that are beneath the surface. So take a look at this image that describes different types of trauma and their potential level of exposure, which correlate to the intensity of the trauma. So we will discuss primary trauma, such as actual injury, and secondary trauma, such as awareness of loss, second or third hand, throughout this presentation. So there are four main types of trauma that we can discuss and think about. So one is acute trauma. So if we think about short-lived experiences or short-lived events that we have, such as Hurricane Katrina, or the death of Sean Reed, or Columbine, or even our COVID-19 pandemic, that's a short-lived event that can be a traumatic experience, depending on how it adversely affects us, the individual. Chronic trauma are experiences that occur repeatedly over long periods of time. So this could include intimate partner violence, which is also known as domestic violence or child abuse. It could be community violence, or even cumulative acute trauma. So when we have traumas that happen over time, let's say, for example, school shootings at one point seem to be happening quite frequently, those acute traumas, when they're cumulative, turn into chronic trauma for us as individuals. Historical trauma, sometimes people refer to this as generational trauma, is collective and cumulative intergenerational trauma that impacts a particular group. These groups of people still suffer the effects of the historical trauma. So this is often due to race, creed, or ethnicity. And so if we think about forced relocation, Native Americans are still impacted by the effects of forced relocation off of tribal lands. If we think about slavery, we can think about the impact of the institution of slavery on the current events that are happening in our world today. Same with the Holocaust, same with institutionalized racism, and same with compulsory sterilization, which impacted people with disabilities. And that still happens today, and there's biases against people with disabilities and the push towards compulsory sterilization. Our fourth type of trauma is complex trauma. So this occurs repeatedly and cumulatively. It often impacts intimate relationships and contexts and happens in our most vulnerable moments. So whether that is a vulnerable time in our development, so as a child or as an older adult, or in conditions of vulnerability to include extreme poverty, for example. So some of the examples that we might think about are multiple military deployments to dangerous locations. And we often hear about veterans and having PTSD. This is often due to complex trauma. Broken cultural connections are often the times when we think about appropriations of cultures and how that impacts, excuse me, how that impacts people's connection to their culture. The same with broken familial connections, which we'll talk about in just a second. So we're going to use an example from Black Lives Matter to work through the different types of trauma to bring those more concretely to you. Let's take the death of George Floyd, who was a 59-year-old Black man who died at the hands of police in 2020, just recently. This is an acute trauma. This is an event that happened at a defined time and a defined place with a defined set of people. As a result of microaggressions based on race, something that is ongoing, something that has happened often over time, and chronic, meaning that it could also be cumulative acute traumas that have added up, can be associated and contributed to the death of George Floyd.
And Fredrica, I'd like to try to check my thinking here about microaggressions. So when I see that word, I usually think about subtle slights or things that people say, ways that people behave based on their own biases they have, they may not even be aware of. These are just inherent biases. So that's microaggressions, but would chronic trauma also be a result of overt racist behaviors in speech, not just the microaggressions?
That's exactly right, Lori. So in this example, we have only talked about one item, but overt acts of racism are also chronic types of trauma. Thanks for bringing that up. So we have the acute Black man being killed, and chronic, we have the microaggressions that, as Lori mentioned, could be the unintentional unintentional reactions to people of a different race because of George Floyd as a Black man and a police officer that was a non-Black man, making those connections. And then we also have institutionalized racism. So along with the and which is one of the reasons I want to say why we start off our work with cognitive debiasing, combating and thinking about how do we protect others from microaggressions, and also how do we check ourselves so that we also are not using microaggressions against other people. So if racism is in the chronic trauma type, then in the historical trauma type is institutionalized racism. So a lot of the structures and institutions that have been built up for reasons that lie in the foundations of racism. So if we think about police departments, that is connected to George Floyd's death, but we have also heard about healthcare and the coronavirus pandemic. So before George Floyd's specific death gained national attention, we heard a lot of information about the health disparities of Black and brown people as it relates to the coronavirus pandemic. And then we also think about the institution of education and how Black and brown boys are suspended at higher rates. And we have also the criminalization of Black girls in those spaces and the invisibility of Native Americans in those spaces. And so if we continue to think about the types of trauma, our next type is complex trauma. So complex trauma, again, is in our most vulnerable moments, in times and experiences and in conditions. And so we're, again, using the Black Lives Matter protest around George Floyd, this cumulative loss of loved ones really impacts us. And it also impacts members of the Black community when it comes to familial connections. So often, times when we hear people talk out around George Floyd, they say, this could have been my brother, or this could have been my father, this could have been my cousin, this was my friend. And so those connections are being broken at the hands of racism, whether that is institutionalized or unintentional or overt acts. So even though we use George Floyd to talk about this particular example, I want to bring your attention to what has been happening since 2012 and this cumulative acute trauma of these individual Black men and women who have died at the hands of police in particular, which has led to this chronic trauma that we have, that we all are now experiencing, that's rooted in historical trauma and that impacts and continues to reinforce the complex traumas that are happening. And so even though the example shows a circular loop around, a circle that closes and starts again with another person, we have to recognize that acute can be directly to historical or chronic. This is a complex system, and we can never say that an individual has only experienced acute trauma or that an individual has only experienced complex trauma. All of these are interwoven together, and it really, again, depends on the event, the experience, and the effects on the individual. So just recently in Indianapolis, 21-year-old Sean Reed was also murdered at the hands of police, and we could have used his example instead of George Floyd. So any of these names here in this table could take the place of an acute trauma and circle through this cycle that has been never ending and is a source, one source of the protests that we see in our nation and across the world. So this is one example of trauma that has many, many layers, but when we layer on top of that everything else that's happening in our world, economic insecurity, the change of what we had known as our normal, new food insecurities and those who are already food insecure, job insecurity, inequities of distance learning across our nation and in our districts, students experiencing transition year when schooling's going to look very different from now on. All of that is layered on top of all of the other traumas that are happening. So these cumulative traumas, which are primary traumas, if you're in the households that are experiencing this, have a great impact on our daily activity and our relationships. So take a minute and read through this list of impacts of primary trauma on daily activity and relationships. So even in this time, as we are at home and some of us are opening back up and we're moving about, we have to remember that in times of trauma, our focus on survival, we have a hyperactive focus on survival. And it's really difficult to think about what's happening in the future. And when we get to secondary traumatic stress, we'll talk about what that looks like in terms of the challenge of being able to not only be present in the moment, but also to look towards hope in the future. If we think specifically about the impact of trauma on students and their school functioning, take a minute and read through this list. So we ourselves often experience primary trauma, but we also experience secondary traumatic stress, which is also known as compassion fatigue. So cumulative emotional stress, whether this is focusing on one student or focusing on a community of 30 students, can lead us to become so emotionally connected to those students that it impacts our stress levels and our ability to cope. And this is very prevalent in the helping professions, whether that is education or nursing or social work. So the impact of secondary traumatic stress can include rigid thinking or this preoccupation with trauma. So oftentimes I have heard educators say, we don't know what's happening in the fall. We don't know how we're going to get by. We don't know what's the next step in terms of being able to go into classrooms and interact with students. How do we build relationships and we may not even be see a student face to face for the first time? That is a symptom of secondary traumatic stress, because instead of thinking of what does this new orientation to schooling look like and what is our hope and what is our ideal scenario, we are preoccupied with what's happening in the here and now. So in order to combat secondary traumatic stress, we also want to focus on our own self-care, and whether that is individual self-care through journaling or joining a support group, or organizational self-care where it's creating opportunities for staff to participate in ways that allow them to have opportunities to help or to adopt policies and promote and support self-care for teachers or educators in a building where there might be a room where teachers can go and have coffee and have conversation and just have time to breathe. If we don't focus on self-care, we know that it will be very difficult for students to recover from their own trauma, because we ourselves as adults are not coping with the stress that has been put on us or dealing with our own trauma. And the next step after secondary traumatic stress is burnout. And burned out educators feel disempowered and disempower students and take from students agency and their ability to meet your expectations and experience success. So if we think about how primary trauma of students and secondary traumatic stress of staff impact relationships with students, some of the things that could happen are at least a time out of class, there's more frequent negative interactions, displaced anger, deficit-based thinking and generalizing to other students, and decrease in our self-efficacy to educate students. So in order to make sure that we're building authentic relationships, we want to think about caring for students, not simply having feelings of care, but actively building and rebuilding relationships with them. And so we want to pay attention to students. We want to ask them questions out of curiosity and not out of need. We want to make sure we demonstrate genuine interest to students and reach out and create opportunities for connection, as well as use asset-based thinking at all times when students are experiencing primary or secondary trauma, or just in your classrooms in general. You can support students with self-care and feelings of safety using in a face-to-face or virtual environment, using different types of strategies that help with students feeling safe. And we don't always realize this when students might argue or walk out or push other students or burst into uncontrollable crying. But what if we are interacting with students from a trauma-sensitive place, then we often always see this behavior as inappropriate. If we're not operating from a place of trauma sensitivity, then we see this as an inappropriate or personal attack. But if we take the time and come from a trauma-sensitive place and return that student to a safe place, then we're more likely to get more from the student. So we want to promote resiliency, and this is the ability of individuals to not succumb to adverse experiences, and we want to build that in ourselves as well as in our students. And we know that resilience involves skills that can be learned and are developmental. So if we return to our chart on the different types of trauma, there are some examples that we can take steps towards resilience. So again, caring for the individual, knowing that trauma impacts the individual. We can teach resiliency skills such as decision-making, planning, self-control. We can support making connections to community supports to help with unresolved grief. We can work towards healing as a greater community. We can also build social connections and talk with others that don't share our same perspective or cultures or beliefs. And we can also build our own emotional competency. So thank you for joining us today. And to learn more about the Center for Education Services at RTI, or to learn more about trauma and primary trauma, secondary traumatic stress, please feel free to reach out to Lori or myself. And we thank you for joining us today.